I have watched the United States confuse pressure with power for most of my professional life, but nowhere is that confusion more evident than in how Washington talks about Venezuela's oil. What is being sold to the public as strategic mastery is, in reality, a narrative constructed to mask policy drift and intelligence failure. The claim that seizing tankers, enforcing blockades, or dictating who may sell oil constitutes control reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of both energy markets and geopolitical leverage. Intelligence was not used to test this assumption, it was used to decorate it. When U.S. officials publicly framed the seizure of Venezuelan linked oil shipments as proof that America could dictate outcomes without military force, they were recycling a familiar illusion. The logic went like this: oil equals money, money equals regime survival, and therefore oil interdiction equals regime compliance. That theory ignored decades of intelligence reporting on sanctions, evasion, gray shipping networks, and the adaptive behavior of sanctioned states. The seizure of tankers allegedly masquerading under foreign flags was presented as decisive action, yet the intelligence reality was far less dramatic. These networks had been operating for years, moving millions of barrels through intermediaries, reflagging vessels, and exploiting jurisdictional gaps. None of this was new to analysts. What was new was the insistence that selective enforcement suddenly changed the strategic equation. The intelligence failure here was not one of collection. We knew where the oil went. We knew which countries bought it. We knew the volumes were insufficient to collapse the Venezuelan state, yet enough to sustain elite survival. The distortion came when policymakers demanded intelligence that confirmed political messaging, that pressure alone could force alignment with U.S. interests. Analysts who raised doubts were sidelined, while assessments emphasizing leverage were elevated. This is how intelligence becomes fiction, when it is filtered to support a predetermined narrative rather than to inform decision-making. The strategic consequence was predictable. Venezuela did not collapse. Its leadership adjusted. Oil continued to flow, albeit at discounted rates, to adversaries willing to absorb political risk. Meanwhile, Washington declared success based on isolated interdictions and rhetorical dominance. The illusion of control replaced sober assessment. Energy markets shrugged, adversaries adapted, and U.S. credibility eroded further as threats were issued that could not be universally enforced. The hard lesson is simple: intelligence cannot substitute for strategy, and pressure without achievable political objectives is not power, it is theater. What followed the illusion of control was something even more corrosive to strategic thinking: the elevation of sanctions from a policy tool into a substitute for strategy itself. I watched this transformation happen in real time. Sanctions were no longer designed to support a political end state. They became the end state. In the case of Venezuela, every tanker seizure, every licensing revocation, every threat against third-party buyers was framed as evidence of progress, even though none of it answered the most basic intelligence question: progress toward what exactly? The intelligence distortion here was subtle but devastating. Analysts were no longer asked to assess whether sanctions would change regime behavior in a measurable way. Instead, they were asked to demonstrate that sanctions were being felt. That is not the same thing. Pain does not equal compliance. Intelligence reporting increasingly focused on short-term disruptions, delayed shipments, reflagged vessels, reduced output figures, while downplaying the adaptive mechanisms that allowed oil flows to continue. Enforcement actions were treated as strategic victories, even when they had no durable effect on Venezuelan decision-making. Sanctions enforcement also became performative. Highly publicized seizures were timed to reinforce political narratives about strength and control, not to achieve lasting leverage. Intelligence officers understood that selective enforcement creates signaling effects, but those signals were misread. Washington interpreted silence or tactical adjustment as weakness. Adversaries interpreted it as confirmation that U.S. power was episodic, not systemic. When sanctions rely on constant escalation to appear effective, they reveal their own fragility. Intelligence assessments warning about enforcement, fatigue, and international noncompliance were routinely softened or ignored. the strategic consequences widened beyond Venezuela. By threatening secondary sanctions against countries buying oil, the United States expanded the target set without expanding enforcement capacity. Intelligence showed clearly that major buyers calculated the risk and often concluded that Washington's threats exceeded its willingness to follow through. This was not deterrence, it was bluff inflation. Each unenforced threat diluted the next one. Sanctions lost their coercive clarity and became background noise in global energy markets. From an intelligence perspective, the most damaging outcome was internal. Analysts learned that accuracy was less valued than alignment. Reporting that questioned sanctions efficacy was seen as obstructionist. Over time, this produced a feedback loop where intelligence confirmed policy optimism justified further sanctions, and failure was redefined as patience. The hard lesson is unavoidable. When sanctions become strategy, intelligence is reduced to public relations support, and the United States forfeits the analytical discipline that once made its power credible. By the time Venezuela became a proving ground for sanctions as strategy, the damage inside the intelligence system was already well advanced. What emerged was a corruption loop that did not rely on falsified data or fabricated reports, but on something far more insidious: selective emphasis, narrative alignment, and career-conditioned silence. I have seen this pattern before, and I recognize it immediately. Intelligence did not fail because it lacked facts. It failed because the institution stopped rewarding inconvenient truth. The loop began with policy. Senior officials signaled clearly what conclusions were acceptable. Venezuela was to be portrayed as economically cornered, diplomatically isolated, and strategically vulnerable. Intelligence tasking flowed downhill from that assumption. Analysts were asked to measure stress, disruption, and pressure, not resilience or adaptation. Reports highlighting continued oil flows through intermediaries, discounted sales to Asia, or quiet logistical support from U.S. Adversaries were acknowledged but deprioritized. Over time, those assessments stopped shaping decisions and instead became footnotes. This was not coercion in the crude sense. No one had to threaten analysts explicitly. The incentives were structural. Analysts who produced assessments aligned with policy framing found their work elevated, briefed, and cited. Those who questioned the core premise that oil pressure equaled control found their reporting buried under qualifiers or delayed in coordination. The system taught its own lessons. Intelligence officers learned that success meant reinforcing confidence, not testing assumptions. That is how professional skepticism erodes without anyone formally ordering it to stop. The strategic consequence was self-deception. Policymakers began to believe their own talking points because intelligence no longer contradicted them forcefully. Each tanker seizure was interpreted as confirmation that the pressure campaign worked. Each Venezuelan adaptation was framed as desperation rather than competence. Intelligence that should have warned about diminishing returns instead provided reassurance. The corruption loop closed when policymakers cited intelligence reports that were in effect reflections of their own expectations. Externally, adversaries understood this dynamic better than Washington did. Russia, China, and Iran watched U.S. sanctions policy and saw not coherence but repetition. They recognized that Washington had invested its credibility in escalation without exit. That knowledge informed their own risk calculations. They did not need to defeat U.S. pressure. They only needed to outlast it. Intelligence should have highlighted this asymmetry. Instead, it became trapped in a cycle of tactical reporting divorced from strategic reality. The hard lesson is, one, intelligence officers are trained to understand, but institutions often forget. Corruption does not require lies. It only requires the quiet removal of doubt. When intelligence stops challenging power and starts validating it, analysis becomes narrative maintenance. That is when intelligence ceases to serve the state and begins serving the illusion of control. Once intelligence was bent to sustain the sanctions narrative, Venezuela ceased to be treated as a country with its own internal dynamics and became something else entirely, a proxy battlefield in a larger confrontation with Russia, China, and Iran. This shift was never honestly acknowledged, but it shaped every subsequent decision. Venezuela's oil was no longer just a revenue stream for Caracas. It was redefined as a lever in a hemispheric power contest. The problem was that Washington entered this contest without clear objectives, clear limits, or a realistic assessment of escalation control. Intelligence reporting showed that Venezuelan oil flows were deeply entangled with the interests of U.S. adversaries. Shipments moved to China under discounted terms, blended through intermediaries, or rerouted to Iran for refining and resale. Russia provided logistical and political cover, not because Venezuela was strategically vital, but because it was a low-cost way to contest U.S. influence in its own hemisphere. These were not secret findings. They were well understood. What changed was how policymakers interpreted them. Instead of seeing entanglement as a warning sign, they treated it as an opportunity to demonstrate resolve. This reframing distorted intelligence priorities. Analysts were pushed to assess how interdictions signaled strength to Moscow or Beijing rather than whether they advanced any achievable outcome in Venezuela itself. The seizure of tankers linked to foreign flags was presented as drawing red lines, even though intelligence showed those lines were porous and selectively enforced. The message Washington believed it was sending, "This is our hemisphere, our rules," was not the message adversaries received. They saw enforcement that depended on publicity, not permanence. The strategic consequence was escalation without strategy. By tying Venezuela policy to great power signaling, the United States expanded the stakes while narrowing its options. Every enforcement action risked confrontation, yet stopping would signal weakness. Intelligence assessments warning that Venezuela had become a low-risk arena for adversaries to test U.S. resolve were acknowledged but not acted upon. The proxy battlefield logic demanded constant motion, more seizures, more sanctions, more declarations of control. Meanwhile, Venezuela's leadership adapted to its new role. It leveraged external backing to survive, traded sovereignty for regime security, and absorbed economic damage as the cost of staying in power. Intelligence should have made clear that this outcome was not accidental but rational. Instead, Washington treated survival as defiance and doubled down. The hard lesson is stark. When a state becomes a proxy, intelligence must redefine success. If it does not, policy drifts into symbolic confrontation, and the original problem, Venezuela's political future, disappears behind a larger, unwinnable narrative contest. As Venezuela policy hardened into proxy confrontation, the damage spread far beyond Caracas. What Washington framed as decisive enforcement was interpreted globally as selective coercion. Intelligence reporting from allies and partners made this clear, even if policymakers preferred not to hear it. The United States was no longer seen as enforcing rules, it was seen as enforcing preferences. That distinction matters enormously in international politics, and ignoring it accelerated the collapse of American credibility. Allies watched the Venezuelan oil campaign closely because it revealed how the United States might treat them under pressure. Intelligence from diplomatic channels showed growing unease, not admiration. European partners questioned the legal basis of extraterritorial enforcement. Energy importing states calculated exposure and quietly diversified away from U.S. controlled systems. Even governments aligned with Washington began asking whether compliance today guaranteed protection tomorrow. Intelligence assessments flagged this erosion, but it conflicted with the narrative that strength breeds respect. Adversaries drew sharper conclusions. They did not interpret tanker seizures as proof of overwhelming power. They saw inconsistency. Enforcement appeared intense one week and absent the next. Secondary sanctions were announced loudly and applied unevenly. Intelligence showed that this pattern encouraged risk-taking. If punishment was unpredictable, then adaptation became worthwhile. China expanded its capacity to absorb discounted oil. Russia refined its shipping camouflage. Iran integrated Venezuelan crude into its broader sanctions evasion ecosystem. None of this required defeating U.S. policy. It required exploiting its credibility gap. The strategic consequence was reputational damage. that intelligence professionals recognize is hard to reverse. Credibility is cumulative, but so is doubt. Each enforcement action justified on the basis of control raised expectations that Washington could deliver outcomes. When those outcomes failed to materialize, the gap between rhetoric and reality widened. Intelligence reporting increasingly documented skepticism toward U.S. claims, even among partners who continued to cooperate publicly. Internally, this credibility collapse fed back into policy failure. Faced with growing doubt, officials relied even more heavily on declarative power, statements of intent, red lines, promises of future enforcement. Intelligence was again asked to validate confidence rather than assess trust. The system chased reassurance instead of correction. That is how strategic narratives die, not with a single defeat, but with accumulated disbelief. The hard lesson intelligence teaches, when allowed to speak honestly, is that credibility cannot be seized like a tanker. It is built through consistent alignment between words and outcomes. In Venezuela, the United States demonstrated pressure without resolution and enforcement without strategy. The world noticed, and once credibility fractures, every subsequent action carries less weight, no matter how loudly it is announced. By the time credibility began to erode, the central myth holding the policy together was the claim of energy leverage. I have heard this argument repeated for years. Control the oil and you control the state. Intelligence reporting has never supported that claim in the Venezuelan case, yet it persisted because it was politically convenient. Energy leverage was treated as a precision instrument when, in reality, it functioned as a blunt force whose effects were diffuse, delayed, and often counterproductive. The intelligence reality was straightforward. Venezuela's oil sector was degraded long before intensified sanctions enforcement. Production declines reflected years of mismanagement, capital flight, and technical decay. Sanctions constrained options, but they did not create leverage in the way policymakers claimed. Intelligence showed that discounted sales, prepayment schemes, barter arrangements, and opaque shipping networks allowed oil to move despite interdictions. Markets adjusted, buyers priced in risk, intermediaries multiplied. The idea that selective seizures could translate into durable control ignored how commodity markets actually work. What intelligence should have forced into the discussion was elasticity. Oil flows are not binary. They do not simply stop because Washington announces a rule. They reroute, reprice, and repackage. Enforcement can raise transaction costs, but raising costs is not the same as dictating outcomes. Intelligence assessments warning that pressure would incentivize long-term decoupling from U.S. influenced systems were consistently downplayed. Instead, political leaders cited short-term disruptions as proof of leverage. The strategic consequence was a widening gap between claimed power and actual influence. The United States announced that it would decide who could buy Venezuelan oil, yet intelligence showed that enforcement depended on cooperation that could not be compelled indefinitely. Each threat to sanction third-party buyers forced partners to weigh compliance against their own energy security. Many chose hedging over alignment. This was not defiance. It was rational behavior in response to unreliable enforcement. Internally, energy leverage, rhetoric, insulated decision makers from reassessment. If oil was the lever, then failure could always be explained as insufficient pressure rather than a flawed premise. Intelligence that challenged the premise was treated as pessimistic. The system rewarded escalation because escalation preserved the illusion that control was just one more action away. That is how strategy ossifies into ritual. The hard lesson is, one, intelligence officers are trained to deliver, but policymakers often resist. Leverage only exists when the other side lacks alternatives and believes you can sustain pressure. In Venezuela, neither condition was met. Energy leverage became a slogan, not a strategy. And when slogans replace analysis, the distance between intention and outcome becomes impossible to close. The final damage from the Venezuelan oil campaign was not measured in barrels seized or revenues denied. It was measured in what the intelligence system lost and what it failed to stop. By the time the limits of pressure became undeniable, the institutional habits that produced the failure were already entrenched. Intelligence had been trained, once again, to accommodate power rather than restrain it. That is the lesson learned too late and at great cost. The record is clear. The United States did not lack information about Venezuela's adaptive capacity, about the resilience of oil markets, or about the willingness of adversaries to absorb risk. Intelligence had cataloged all of it. What failed was the willingness to let those assessments alter policy direction. Instead, intelligence was folded into a narrative of control that policymakers could not abandon without admitting strategic error. Once that happened, escalation became the only politically viable move, even as its effectiveness declined. The strategic consequence is now visible. Venezuela remains politically unresolved. U.S. influence in the hemisphere is weaker, not stronger. Adversaries have refined sanctions evasion techniques that will be reused elsewhere. Allies have learned to hedge against American unpredictability. Intelligence officers, meanwhile, have absorbed another cautionary example of what happens when analysis is subordinated to messaging. These outcomes were not unforeseeable. They were documented, briefed, and then ignored. The hardest lesson for intelligence professionals is not about Venezuela itself, but about institutional survival. When intelligence becomes a tool to validate decisions rather than challenge them, it loses its corrective function. That loss does not announce itself dramatically. It accumulates quietly, assessment by assessment, until strategic failure appears sudden and inexplicable to those who engineered it. The Venezuelan oil narrative followed that pattern precisely. Looking forward, the damage is not irreversible, but it is real. Rebuilding credibility requires more than changing tactics. It requires restoring the role of intelligence as an adversarial process, one that tests assumptions, highlights trade-offs, and forces policymakers to confront limits. That means accepting uncertainty, admitting when leverage does not exist, and resisting the temptation to declare control where none can be sustained. The hard lesson intelligence learned too late is the one it has always known. Power is not proven by how loudly it is asserted, but by how accurately it is understood. In Venezuela, the United States asserted control and lost understanding. Until that balance is restored, strategic narratives will continue to collapse under the weight of their own fiction.